Welcome to day 3 of the 12 Days of CraftLit. Today we're going to start with a whole lot by Laurence Dunbar. Christmas, Christmas Carol, An Old Time Christmas, Speakin of Christmas, and Christmas in the Heart. Along with those, we will have Jimmy Scarecrow's Christmas by Mary Eleanor Wilkins Freeman, Turkeys Turning the Tables, and Christmas Every Day, 2 of my personal favorites, and The Gift of the Magi and the Potato Child. If you haven't listened to the day 1, the first day of CraftLit, you may want to go do that. All of the information on how and where to find other episodes will be in that opening. However, the short version is, if you're watching/listening on YouTube, you can get the playlist on our YouTube channel. And if you are looking at show notes and listening to this as an actual audio podcast, if you look in the show notes, you will see not only links to all the previous episodes, but time codes telling you where to fast wind to or rewind to be able to listen to exactly the right story that you want to listen to. So sit back, relax, enjoy, or putter around like a crazy person and get things ready for Christmas and enjoy our stories for today. Here we go.
Christmas by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Read by Douglas Nathaniel Williams. Step with the banjo and glide with the fiddle. This ain't no time for the potter and piddle, for Christmas is coming, it's right on the way, and it's ours to dance for the break of the day. What if the wind is tearing and whistling? Look at that fire, how it's spitting and bristling. Heating the ashes and heating the cinders. Old Mr. Frost can just look through these windows. Heat up the toddy and pass the warm glasses. Don't stop to shiver at blowings and blasts. Keep on the kittle and keep it a-humming. Eat all and drink all, there's lots a-coming. Look here, Maria, don't open that oven. You want all these people a-pushing and shoving? Rest from the dance? Yes, you done cotch that odor. Mammy done cotched it, and Lord, it nigh flowed her. Possum is monstrous for making folks find it. Come, draw up your cheers. I do mind it. Eat up them critters, you men folks and womens. Possums ain't scarce when there's lots of persimmons.
Christmas Carol by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Ring out, ye bells, all nature swells with gladness at the wondrous story. The world was lorn, but Christ is born to change our sadness into glory. Sing, earthlings, sing! Tonight a King hath come from heaven's high throne to bless us. The outstretched hand o'er all the land is raised in pity to caress us. Come at his call, be joyful all, away with mourning and with sadness. The heavenly choir, with holy fire, their voices raise in songs of gladness. The darkness breaks, and dawn awakes, her cheeks suffused with youthful blushes. The rocks and stones in holy tones are singing sweeter than the rushes. Then why should we in silence be, when nature lends her voice to praises? When heaven and earth proclaim the truth of him for whom that lone star blazes? No, be not still, but with a will strike all your harps and set them ringing. On hill and heath let every breath throw all its power into singing. End of Christmas Carol by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Recording by Raven Notation.
An Old-Time Christmas, from The Strength of Gideon and Other Stories, by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Read by Alan Davis Drake. An Old-Time Christmas. When the holidays came round, the thoughts of Liza Ann Lewis always turned to the good times that she used to have at home, when, following the precedent of antebellum days, Christmas lasted all the week and good cheer held sway. She remembered with regret the gifts that were given, the songs that were sung to the tinkling of the banjo and the dances with which they beguiled the night hours, and the eating. Could she forget it? The great turkey with the fat literally bursting from him, the yellow yam melting into deliciousness in the mouth, or at some more fortunate season, even the juicy possum grinning in brown and greasy death from the great platter. In the 10 years she had lived in New York, she had known no such feast day. Food was strangely dear in the metropolis, and then there was always the weekly rental of the poor room to be paid. But she had kept the memory of the old times green in her heart, and ever turned to it with the fondness of one for something irretrievably lost. That is how Jimmy came to know about it. Jimmy was 13 and small for his age, and he could not remember any such times as his mother told him about, although he said with great pride to his partner and rival, Blinky Scott, "Geez, Blink, you ought to hear my old lady talk about the days they had down where we come from at Christmas. New York ain't in it with them. You can just bet." And Blinky, who was a New Yorker clean through, with a New Yorker's contempt for anything outside of the city, had promptly replied with a downward spreading of his right hand, "Ah, forget it." Jimmy felt a little crestfallen for a minute, but he lifted himself in his own estimation by threatening to do Blinky, and the cloud rolled by. Liza Ann knew that Jimmy couldn't ever understand what she meant by an old-time Christmas unless she could show him by some faint approach to its merrymaking, and it had been the dream of her life to do this. But every year she had failed, until now she was a little ahead. Her plan was too good to keep, and when Jimmy went out that Christmas Eve morning to sell his papers, she had disclosed it to him, and bade him hurry home as soon as he was done, for they were to have a real old-time Christmas. Jimmy exhibited as much pleasure as he deemed consistent with his dignity, and promised to be back early to add his earnings to the fund for celebration. When he was gone, Liza Ann counted over her savings lovingly, and dreamed of what she could buy her boy, and what she would have for dinner the next day. Then a voice, a colored man's voice, she knew, floated up to her. Someone in the alley below her window was singing "The Old Folks at Home." All up and down the whole creation, sadly I roam, still longing for the old plantation, and for the old folks at home. She leaned out of the window and listened, and when the song had ceased and she drew her head in again, there were tears in her eyes, the tears of memory and longing. But she crushed them away, and laughed tremendously to herself as she said, "What a regular old fool I'm a-getting to be." Then she went out into the cold, snow-covered streets, for she had work to do that day that would add a mite to her little Christmas store. Down in the street, Jimmy was calling out the morning papers and racing with Blinky Scott for prospective customers. These were only transients, of course, for each had his regular buyers whose preferences were scrupulously respected by both, in agreement with a strange silent compact. The electric cars went clanging to and fro. The streets were full of shoppers with bundles and bunches of holly, and all the sights and sounds were pregnant with the message of the joyous time. People were full of the holiday spirit. The papers were going fast, and the little colored boy's pockets were filled with the desired coins. It would have been all right with Jimmy if the policeman hadn't come up on him just as he was about to toss the bones, and when Blinky Scott had him faded to the amount of 5 hard-earned pennies. Well, they were trying to suppress youthful gambling in New York, and the officer had to do his duty. The others scuttled away. But Jimmy was so absorbed in the game that he didn't see the cop until he was right above him. So he was pinched. He blubbered a little and wiped his grimy face with his grimier sleeve until it was one long brown smear. You know, this was Jimmy's first time. The big bluecoat looked a little bit ashamed as he marched him down the street, followed at a distance by a few hooting boys. Some of the holiday shoppers turned to look at them as they passed and murmured, "Poor little chap, I wonder what he's been up to now." Others said sarcastically, "It seems strange that copper didn't call for help." A few of his brother officers grinned at him as he passed, and he blushed. But the dignity of the law must be upheld, and the crime of gambling among the newsboys was a growing evil. Yes, the dignity of the law must be upheld, and though Jimmy was only a small boy, it would be well to make an example of him. So his name and age were put down on the blotter, and over against them the offense with which he was charged. Then he was locked up to await trial the next morning. "It's shameful," the bearded sergeant said, "how the kids are carrying on these days. People are feeling pretty generous, and they'll toss 'em a nickel or a dime for the paper and tell 'em to keep the change for Christmas. And first thing you know, the little beggars are shooting craps or pitching pennies. We've got to make an example of some of 'em." Liza Ann Lewis was tearing through her work that day to get home and do her Christmas shopping, and she was singing as she worked some such old song as she used to sing in the good old days back home. She reached her room late and tired, but happy. Visions of a wakening up time for her and Jimmy were on her mind, but Jimmy wasn't there. "I wonder what that little scamp is," she said, smiling. "I told him to hurry home, but I reckon he's staying out later with the evening papers so as to bring home more money." Hour after hour passed, and he did not come, and then she grew alarmed. At 2 o'clock in the morning she could stand it no longer, and she went over and awakened Blinky Scott, much to the young gentleman's disgust, who couldn't see why any woman need make such a fuss about a kid. He told her laconically that Jimmy was pinched for throwing the bones. She heard with a sinking heart and went home to her own room to walk the floor all night and sob. In the morning, with all her Christmas savings tied up in a handkerchief, she hurried down to Jefferson Market courtroom. There was a full blotter that morning, and the judge was rushing through it. He wanted to get home to his Christmas dinner, but he paused long enough when he got to Jimmy's case to deliver a brief but stern lecture upon the evil of child gambling in New York. He said that as it was Christmas Day, he would like to release the prisoner with a reprimand, but he thought that this had been done too often and that it was high time to make an example of one of the offenders. Well, it was fine or imprisonment. Liza Ann struggled up through the crowd of spectators, and her Christmas treasure, added to what Jimmy had, paid his fine, and they went out of the courtroom together. When they were in the room again, she put the boy to bed, for there was no fire and no coal to make one. Then she wrapped herself in a shabby shawl and sat huddled up over the empty stove. Down in the alley she heard the voice of the day before singing, "Oh, darkies, how my heart grows weary, far from the old folks at home." And she burst into tears. End of An Old-Time Christmas
Speaking of Christmas by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Read by Douglas Nathaniel Williams. Breezes blowing middling brisk, snowflakes through the air a whisk, falling kinda soft and light. Not enough to make things white, but us sorta sifting down so as to cover up the brown of the dark world's rugged ways and make things look like holidays. Not smooth over, but just speckled, sort of straining for effect, and not quite a getting through what it started in to do. Mercy's sakes, it does seem queer. Christmas Day is most nigh here. Somehow, it don't seem to me Christmas like it used to be. Christmas with its ice and snow, Christmas of the long ago. You could feel it stir and hum weeks and weeks before it come. Something in the atmosphere told you when the day was near. Didn't need no almanacs, that was just one of nature's facts. Every cottage decked out gay, cedar wreaths and holly spray. And the stores, how they were dressed, tinsel till you couldn't rest. Every window fixed up packed candy canes and things like that. Noah's arks and guns and dolls and all kinds of falderalls. Then with the frosty bells a chime, sliding down the hills a time, right amidst the fun and din, Christmas come a bustling in. Raised his cheery voice a call out a welcome to us all. Hale and hearty, strong and bluff, that was Christmas sure enough. Snow knee-deep and coasting fine. Frozen mill ponds all a-shine, seeming just to lay in wake, begging you to come and skate. And you'd get your gal and go stumping cheerily through the snow, feeling pleased and skeert and warm, 'cause she had a holt your arm. Why, when Christmas come in, we spent the whole glad day in glee, having fun and feasting high, and some courting on the sly, busting in some neighbor's door, and then suddenly, before he could give his voice a lift, yelling at him, "Christmas gift!" Now, such things are never heard. Merry Christmas is the word, but it's only change a name and means given just the same. There's too many new style ways now about the holidays. I'd just like once more to see Christmas like it used to be.
Fireside Christmas Short Stories. Jimmy Scarecrow's Christmas by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Recorded by Laura Armentrout. Jimmy Scarecrow led a sad life in the winter. Jimmy's greatest grief was his lack of occupation. He liked to be useful, and in winter he was absolutely of no use at all. He wondered how many such miserable winters he would have to endure. He was a young scarecrow, and this was his first one. He was strongly made, and although his wooden joints creaked a little when the wind blew, he did not grow in the least rickety. Every morning when the wintry sun peered like a hard yellow eye across the dry corn stubble, Jimmy felt sad. But at Christmas time, his heart nearly broke. On Christmas Eve, Santa Claus came in his sledge, heaped high with presents, urging his team of reindeer across the field. He was on his way to the farmhouse where Betsy lived with her Aunt Hannah. Betsy was a very good little girl with very smooth yellow curls, and she had a great many presents. Santa Claus had a large wax doll baby for her on his arm, tucked up against the fur collar of his coat. He was afraid to trust it in the pack, lest it get broken. When poor Jimmy Scarecrow saw Santa Claus, his heart gave a great leap. "Santa Claus! Here I am!" he cried out. But Santa Claus did not hear him. "Santa Claus, please give me a little present," I was good all summer and kept the crows out of the corn," pleaded the poor Scarecrow in his choking voice. But Santa Claus passed by with a merry "Hello!" and a great clamor of bells. Then Jimmy Scarecrow stood in the corn stubble and shook with sobs until his joints creaked. "I am of no use in the world, and everybody has forgotten me," he moaned. But he was mistaken. The next morning, Betsy sat at the window, holding her Christmas doll baby, and she looked out at Jimmy Scarecrow standing alone in the field amidst the corn stubble. "Aunt Hannah?" said she. Aunt Hannah was making a crazy patchwork quilt, and she frowned hard at a triangular piece of red silk and a circular piece of pink, wondering how to fit them together. "Well," said she, "did Santa Claus bring the Scarecrow any Christmas present?" "No, of course he didn't." "Why not?" "Because he's a Scarecrow. Don't ask silly questions." "I wouldn't like to be treated so if I was a Scarecrow," said Betsy. But her Aunt Hannah did not hear her. She was busy cutting a triangular snip out of the round piece of pink silk so the piece of red silk could be feather-stitched into it. It was snowing hard out of doors, and the north wind blew. The Scarecrow's poor old coat got whiter and whiter with snow. Sometimes he almost vanished in the thick white storm. Aunt Hannah worked until the middle of the afternoon on her crazy quilt. Then she got up and spread it out over the sofa with an air of pride. "There," said she, "that's done, and that makes the 8th. I've got one for every bed in the house, and I've given 4 away. I'd give this away if I knew of anybody that wanted it." Aunt Hannah put on her hood and shawl and drew some blue yarn stockings on over her shoes and set out through the snow to carry a slice of plum pudding to her sister Susan, who lived down the road. Half an hour after Aunt Hannah had gone, Betsy put her little red plaid shawl over her head and ran across the field to Jimmy Scarecrow. She carried her new doll baby smuggled up under her shawl. "Wish you Merry Christmas," she said to Jimmy Scarecrow. "Wish you the same," said Jimmy, but his voice was choked with sobs and was also muffled, for his old hat had slipped down to his chin. Betsy looked pitifully at the old hat fringed with icicles like frozen tears, and the old snow-laden coat. "I've brought you a Christmas present," said she, and with that she tucked her doll baby inside Jimmy Scarecrow's coat, sticking its tiny feet into a pocket. "Thank you," said Jimmy Scarecrow faintly. "You're welcome," said she. "Keep her under your overcoat so the snow won't wet her, and she won't catch cold. She's delicate." "Yes, I will," said Jimmy Scarecrow, and he tried hard to bring one of his stiff, outstretched arms around to clasp the doll baby. "Don't you feel cold in that old summer coat?" asked Betsy. "If I had a little exercise, I should be warm," he replied. But he shivered, and the wind whistled through his rags. "You wait a minute," said Betsy, and was off across the field. Jimmy Scarecrow stood in the corn stubble with the doll baby under his coat and waited, and soon Betsy was back again, with Aunt Hannah's crazy quilt trailing in the snow behind her. "Here," said she, Here is something to keep you warm." And she folded the crazy quilt around the Scarecrow and pinned it. "Aunt Hannah wants to give it away if anybody wants it," she explained. "She's got so many crazy quilts in the house now, she doesn't know what to do with them. Goodbye. Be sure you keep the doll baby covered up." And with that, she ran across the field and left Jimmy Scarecrow alone with the crazy quilt and the doll baby. The bright flash of colors under Jimmy's hat brim dazzled his eyes, and he felt a little alarmed. "I hope this quilt is harmless, if it is crazy," he said. But the quilt was warm, and he dismissed his fears. Soon, the doll baby whimpered, but he creaked his joints a little, and that amused it, and he heard it cooing inside his coat. Jimmy Scarecrow had never felt so happy in his life as he did for an hour or so. But after that, the snow began to turn to rain, and the crazy quilt was soaked through and through. And not only that, but his coat and the poor doll baby. It cried pitifully for a while, and then it was still. And he was afraid it was dead. It grew very dark, and the rain fell in sheets. The snow melted, and Jimmy Scarecrow stood halfway up his old boots in water. He was saying to himself that the saddest hour of his life had come, when suddenly he again heard Santa Claus's sleigh bells and his merry voice talking to his reindeer. It was after midnight. Christmas was over, and Santa was hastening home to the North Pole. "Santa Claus! Dear Santa Claus!" cried Jimmy Scarecrow with a great sob. And that time Santa Claus heard him and drew rein. "Who's there?" he shouted out of the darkness. "It's only me," replied the Scarecrow. "Who's me?" shouted Santa Claus. "Jimmy Scarecrow." Santa got out of his sledge and waded up. "Have you been standing here ever since corn was ripe?" he asked pityingly. And Jimmy replied that he had. "What's that over your shoulders?" Santa Claus continued, holding up his lantern. "It's a crazy quilt." "And what are you holding under your coat?" "The doll baby that Betsy gave me, and I'm afraid it's dead," poor Jimmy Scarecrow sobbed. "Nonsense!" cried Santa Claus. "Let me see it." And with that he pulled the doll baby out from under the Scarecrow's coat and patted its back and shook it a little, and it began to cry and then to crow. "It's all right," said Santa Claus. "This is the doll baby I gave Betsy, and it is not at all delicate. It went through the measles, and the chicken pox, and the mumps, and the whooping cough before it left the North Pole. Now get into the sledge, Jimmy Scarecrow, and bring the doll baby and the crazy quilt. I've never had any quilts that weren't in their right minds at the North Pole, but maybe I can cure this one. Get in!" Santa chirruped to his reindeer, and they drew the sledge up close in a beautiful curve. "Get in, Jimmy Scarecrow, and come with me to the North Pole," he cried. "Please, how long shall I stay?" asked Jimmy Scarecrow. "Why, you're going to live with me," replied Santa Claus. "I've been looking for a person like you for a long time." "Are there any crows to scare away at the North Pole? I want to be useful," Jimmy Scarecrow said anxiously. "No," answered Santa Claus, "but I don't want you to scare away crows. I want you to scare away Arctic explorers. I can keep you in work for 1,000 years, and scaring away Arctic explorers from the North Pole is much more important than scaring away crows from corn. Why, if they found the pole, there wouldn't be a piece an inch long left in a week's time, and the earth would cave in like an apple without a core. They would whittle it all to pieces and carry it away in their pockets for souvenirs. Come along. I am in a hurry.
I will go on 2 conditions, said Jimmy. First, I want to make a present to Aunt Hannah and Betsy next Christmas.
You shall make them any present you choose. What else?
I want some way provided to scare the crows out of the corn next summer while I am away, said Jimmy.
That is easily managed, said Santa Claus. Just wait a minute.
Santa took his stylographic pen out of his pocket, went with his lantern close to one of the fence posts, and wrote these words upon it: Notice to crows. Whichever crow shall hereafter hop, fly, or flop into this field during the absence of Jimmy Scarecrow, and therefrom purloin, steal, or abstract corn, shall be instantly, in a twinkling and a trice, turned snow white, and be ever after a disgrace, a byword, and a reproach to his whole race. Per order of Santa Claus. The corn will be safe now, said Santa Claus. Get in! Jimmy got into the sledge, and they flew away over the fields out of sight with merry halloos and a great clamor of bells. The next morning, there was much surprise at the farmhouse when Aunt Hannah and Betsy looked out of the window, and the Scarecrow was not in the field, holding out his stiff arms over the corn stubble. Betsy had told Aunt Hannah she had given away the crazy quilt and the doll baby, but had been scolded very little. You must not give away anything of yours again without asking permission, said Aunt Hannah. And you have no right to give anything of mine, even if you know I don't want it. Now, both my pretty quilt and your beautiful doll baby are spoiled. That was all Aunt Hannah had said. She thought she would send John after the quilt and the doll baby next morning, as soon as it was light. But Jimmy Scarecrow was gone, and the crazy quilt and the doll baby with him. John, the servant man, searched everywhere, but not a trace of them could he find. They must have all blown away, Mum, he said to Aunt Hannah. We shall have to have another Scarecrow next summer, said she. But the next summer there was no need of a Scarecrow, for not a crow came past the fence post on which Santa Claus had written his notice to crows. The cornfield was never so beautiful, and not a single grain was stolen by a crow, and everybody wondered at it, for they could not read the crow language in which Santa had written. It is a great mystery to me why the crows don't come into our cornfield when there is no Scarecrow, said Aunt Hannah. But she had a still greater mystery to solve when Christmas came round again. Then she and Betsy had each a strange present. They found them in the sitting room on Christmas morning. Aunt Hannah's present was her old crazy quilt, remodeled, with every piece cut square and true, and matched exactly to its neighbor. Why, it's my old crazy quilt. But it isn't crazy now, cried Aunt Hannah, and her very spectacles seemed to glisten with amazement. Betsy's present was her doll baby of the Christmas before, but the doll was a year older. She had grown an inch and could walk and say, "Mama," and "How do?" She was changed a good deal, but Betsy knew her at once. "It's my doll baby," she cried, and snatched her up and kissed her. But neither Aunt Hannah nor Betsy ever knew that the quilt and the doll were Jimmy Scarecrow's Christmas presents to them. End of Jimmy Scarecrow's Christmas by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman.
Christmas in the Heart by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Read by Douglas Nathaniel Williams. The snow lies deep upon the ground, and winter's brightness all around decks bravely out the forest sere with jewels of the brave old year. The coasting crowd upon the hill with some new spirit seems to thrill, and all the temple bells that chime ring out the glee of Christmas time. In happy homes the brown oak bough vies with the red-gemmed holly now, and here and there like pearls there show the berries of the mistletoe. A sprig upon the chandelier says to the maidens, "Come not here." Even the pauper of the earth some kindly gift has cheered to mirth. Within his chamber, dim and cold, there sits a grasping miser old. He has no thought save one of gain, to grind and gather and grasp and drain. A peal of bells, a merry shout assails his ear, gazes out upon a world to him all grey, and snarls, "Why, this is Christmas Day." No man of ice, for shame, for Christmas Day is no mere name. No, not for you this ringing cheer, this festal season of the year, and not for you the chime of bells from holy temple rolls and swells. In day and deed he has no part who holds not Christmas in his heart.
If you have a book lover or bibliophile in your life, then consider gifting them a premium membership. Our premium membership gives you access to book parties, watch parties, Discord access, and all our premium books, our premium audio, and occasionally video content, all for an entire year. Go to craftlit.gumroad.com. That's CRAFT as in Tom, LIT.gumroad, GUM as in Mary, ROAD as in dog.com, and give someone a premium membership, or go to craftlit.com/premium to get the membership for yourself.
Christmas Every Day and Other Stories Told for Children by William Dean Howells. Story 2, Turkeys Turning the Tables. "Well, you see," the papa began, on Christmas morning, when the little girl had snuggled in his lap into just the right shape for listening, "it was the night after Thanksgiving, and you know how everybody feels the night after Thanksgiving." "Yes, but you needn't begin that way, papa," said the little girl. "I'm not going to have any moral to it this time." "No, indeed, but it can be a true story, can't it?" "I don't know," said the little girl. "I like made-up ones." "Well, this is going to be a true one anyway, and it's no use talking." All the relations in the neighborhood had come to dinner, and then gone back to their own houses, but some of the relations had come from a distance, and these had to stay all night at the grandfather's. But whether they went or whether they stayed, they all told the grandmother that they did believe it was the best Thanksgiving dinner they had ever eaten in their born days. They had had cranberry sauce, and they had mashed potato, and they had mince pie and pan dowdy, and they'd had celery, and they'd had Hubbard squash, and they'd had tea and coffee, both, and they'd had apple dumpling with hard sauce, and they'd had hot biscuit and sweet pickle and mangoes and frosted cake and nuts and cauliflower. Oh, don't mix them all up so, pleaded the little girl. It's perfectly confusing. I can't hardly tell what they had now. Well, they mixed them up just in the same way, and I suppose that's one of the reasons why it happened. Whenever a child wanted to go back from dumpling and frosted cake to mashed potato and Hubbard squash, they were old-fashioned kind of people, and they had everything on the table at once, because the grandmother and the aunties cooked it, and they couldn't keep jumping up all the time to change the plates. And its mother said it shouldn't, its grandmother said indeed it should, then, and helped it herself, and the child's father would say, well, he guessed he would go back too for a change, and the child's mother would say she should think he would be ashamed, and then they would all get to going back, till everything was perfectly higgledy-piggledy. Oh, shouldn't you like to have been there, Papa? Sighed the little girl. You mustn't interrupt. Now, where was I? Higgledy-piggledy. Oh, yes. Well, but the greatest thing of all was the turkey that they had. It was a gobbler. I tell you that it was nearly as big as a giraffe. Papa! It took the premium at the county fair, and when it was dressed it weighed 15 pounds. Well, maybe 20, and it was so heavy that the grandmothers and the aunties couldn't put it on the table, and they had to get one of the papas to do it. You ought to have heard the hurrahing when the children saw him coming in from the kitchen with it. It seemed as if they couldn't hardly talk of anything but that turkey the whole dinner time. The grandfather hated to carve, and so one of the papas did it. And whenever he gave anybody a piece, the grandfather would tell some new story about the turkey, till pretty soon the aunties got to saying, "Now, father, stop." And one of them said it made it seem as if the gobbler was walking about on the table to hear so much about him, and it took her appetite all away. And that made the papas begin to ask the grandfather more and more about the turkey. Yes, said the little girl thoughtfully, I know what papas are. Yes, they're pretty much all alike. And the mammas began to say they acted like a lot of silly boys, and what would the children think? But nothing could stop it, and all through the afternoon and evening, whenever the papas saw any of the aunties or mammas round, they would begin to ask the grandfather more particulars about the turkey. The grandfather was pretty forgetful, and he told the same things right over. Well, and so it went on till it came bedtime, and then the mammas and aunties began to laugh and whisper together, and to say they did believe they should dream about that turkey. And when the papas kissed the grandmother good night, they said, well, they must have his mate for Christmas, and then they put their arms round the mammas and went out haw-hawing. I don't think they behaved very dignified, said the little girl. Well, you see, they were just funning, and had got going, and it was Thanksgiving anyway. Well, in about half an hour, everybody was fast asleep and dreaming. Is it going to be a dream? Asked the little girl, with some reluctance. Didn't I say it was going to be a true story? Yes. How can it be a dream, then? You said everybody was fast asleep and dreaming. Well, but I hadn't got through. Everybody except one little girl. Now, Papa. What? Don't you go and say her name was the same as mine, and her eyes the same color. What an idea! This was a very good little girl, and very respectful to her papa, and didn't suspect him of tricks, but just believed everything he said. And she was a very pretty little girl, and had red eyes and blue cheeks and straight hair and a curly nose. "Now, papa, if you get to cutting up—" "Well, I won't then." Well, she was rather a delicate little girl, and whenever she overate or anything, have bad dreams. Aha! I told you it was going to be a dream. You wait till I get through. She was apt to lie awake thinking, and some of her thinks were pretty dismal. Well, that night, instead of thinking and tossing and turning and counting 1,000, it seemed to this other little girl that she began to see things as soon as she had got warm in bed, and before even. And the first thing she saw was a large, bronze-colored turkey gobbler. No, ma'am, Turkey Gobbler's ghost. "Phoo," said the little girl, rather uneasily. "Who ever heard of a turkey's ghost? I should like to know." "Never mind that," said the papa. "If it hadn't been a ghost, could the moonlight have shone through it? No, indeed. The stuffing wouldn't have let it. So you see it must have been a ghost." It had a red pasteboard placard around its neck, with "First Premium" printed on it, and so she knew that it was the ghost of the very turkey they had had for dinner. It was perfectly awful when it put up its tail and dropped its wings, and strutted just the way the grandfather said it used to do. It seemed to be in a wide pasture, like the back of the house, and the children had to cross it to get home, and they were all afraid of the turkey that kept gobbling at them and threatening them, because they had eaten him up. At last one of the boys, it was the other girl's brother, said he would run across and get his papa to come out and help them, and the first thing she knew, the turkey was after him, gaining, 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 and all the grass was full of hen turkeys and turkey chicks running after him, and gaining, 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 and just as he was getting to the wall, he tripped and fell over a turkey pen, and all at once she was in one of the aunties' room, and the auntie was in bed, and the turkeys were walking up and down over her, and stretching out their wings, and blaming her. 2 of them carried a platter of chicken pie, and there was a large pumpkin jack-o'-lantern hanging to the bedpost to light the room, and it looked just like the other little girl's brother in the face, only perfectly ridiculous. Then the old gobbler, First Premium, clapped his wings and said, "Come on, children," and then they all seemed to be in her room, and she was standing in the middle of it in her nightgown, and tied round and round with ribbons, so she couldn't move hand or foot. The old gobbler, First Premium, said they were going to turn the tables now, and she knew what he meant, for they had had that in the reader at school, just before vacation, and the teacher had explained it. He made a long speech, with his hat on, and kept pointing at her with one of his wings, while he told the other turkeys that it was her grandfather who had done it, and now it was their turn. He said that human beings had been eating turkeys ever since the discovery of America, and it was time for the turkeys to begin paying them back, if they were ever going to. He said she was pretty young, but she was as big as he was, and he had no doubt they would enjoy her. The other little girl tried to tell him that she was not to blame, and that she only took a very, very little piece. But it was right off the breast, said the gobbler, and he shed tears, so that the other little girl cried too. She didn't have much hopes, they all seemed so spiteful, especially the little turkey chicks, but she told them that she was very tender-hearted, and never hurt a single thing, and she tried to make them understand that there was a great difference between eating people and just eating turkeys. What difference, I should like to know, says the old hen turkey, pretty snappishly. People have got souls and turkeys haven't, says the other little girl. I don't see how that makes it any better, says the old hen turkey. It don't make it any better for the turkeys. If we haven't got any souls, we can't live after we've been eaten up, and you can. The other little girl was awfully frightened to have the hen turkey take that tack. I should think she would have been, said the little girl, and she cuddled snugger into her papa's arms. What could she say? Ah, go on. Well, she didn't know what to say, that's a fact. You see, she never thought of it in that light before. All she could say was, well, people have got reason anyway, and turkeys have only got instinct. So there. You'd better look out, said the old hen turkey, and all the little turkey chicks got so mad they just hopped, and the oldest little he turkey, that was just beginning to be a gobbler, he dropped his wings and spread his tail just like his father, and walked round the other little girl till it was perfectly frightful. I should think they would have been ashamed. Well, perhaps old First Premium was a little, because he stopped them. My dear, he says to the old hen turkey and chickledren, you forget yourselves. You should have a little consideration. Perhaps you wouldn't behave much better yourselves if you were just going to be eaten. And they all began to scream and to cry, we've been eaten, and we're nothing but turkey ghosts. There now, Papa, says the little girl, sitting up straight so as to argue better. I knew it wasn't true all along. How could turkeys have ghosts if they don't have souls? I should like to know. Oh, easily, said the papa. Tell how, said the little girl. Now look here, said the papa. Are you telling this story, or am I? You are, said the little girl, and she cuddled down again. Go on. Well, then, don't you interrupt. Where was I? Oh, yes. Well, he couldn't do anything with them, old First Premium couldn't. They acted perfectly ridiculous, and one little brat of a spiteful little chick piped out, I speak for a drumstick, Ma. And then they all began, I want a wing, Ma, and I'm going to have the wishbone, and I shall have just as much stuffing as ever I please, shan't I, Ma? Till the other little girl was perfectly disgusted with them. She thought they oughtn't to say it before her anyway. But she had hardly thought this before they all screamed out, they used to say it before us, and then she didn't know what to say, because she knew how people talked before animals. I don't believe I ever did, said the little girl. Go on. Well, old First Premium tried to quiet them again, and when he couldn't, he apologized to the other little girl so nicely that she began to like him. He said they didn't mean any harm by it. They were just excited, and chickledren would be chickledren. Yes, said the other little girl, but I think you might take some older person to begin with. It's a perfect shame to begin with a little girl. Begin, says old First Premium. Do you think we're just beginning? Why, when do you think it is? The night after Thanksgiving? What year? 1886. They all gave a perfect screech. Why, it's Christmas Eve, 1900, and every one of your friends has been eaten up long ago, says old First Premium, and he began to cry over her, and the old hen turkey and the little turkey chicks began to wipe their eyes on the backs of their wings. I don't think they were very neat, said the little girl. Well, they were kind-hearted, anyway, and they felt sorry for the other little girl, and she began to think she had made some little impression on them when she noticed the old hen turkey beginning to untie her bonnet strings, and the turkey chicks began to spread round her in a circle with the points of their wings touching, so that she couldn't get out, and they commenced dancing and singing, and after a while that little he-turkey says, "Who's it?" And the other little girl, she didn't know why, says, "I'm it." And the first premium says, "Do you promise?" And the other little girl says, "Yes, I promise." And she knew she was promising, if they would let her go, that people should never eat turkeys any more. And the moon began to shine brighter and brighter through the turkeys, and pretty soon it was the sun, and then it was not the turkeys, but the window curtains. It was one of those old farmhouses where they didn't have any blinds, and the other little girl— "Woke up!" shouted the little girl. "There now, Papa, what did I tell you? I knew it was a dream all along." "No, she didn't," said the papa, "and it wasn't a dream." "What was it then?" "It was a trance." The little girl turned round and knelt on her papa's lap, so as to take him by the shoulders and give him a good shaking. That made him promise to be good pretty quick, and "Very well, then," says the little girl, "if it wasn't a dream, you've got to prove it." "But how can I prove it?" says the papa. "By going on with the story," says the little girl, and she cuddled down again. "Oh, well, that's easy enough." As soon as it was light in the room, the other little girl could see that the place was full of people, crammed and jammed, and they were all awfully excited and kept yelling, "Down with the traitress!" "Away with the renegade!" "Shame on the little sneak!" till it was worse than the turkeys 10 times. She knew that they meant her, and she tried to explain that she just had to promise, and that if they had been in her place they would have promised too, and of course they could do as they pleased about keeping her word, but she was going to keep it anyway, and never, never, never eat another piece of turkey, either at Thanksgiving or at Christmas. "Very well, then," says an old lady, who looked like her grandmother, and then began to have a crown on, and to turn into Queen Victoria, "what can we have?" "Well," says the other little girl, "you can have oyster soup." "What else?" "And you can have cranberry sauce." "What else?" You can have mashed potatoes and Hubbard squash and celery and turnip and cauliflower." "What else?" "You can have mince pie and pandowdy and plum pudding." "And not a thing on the list," says the Queen, "that doesn't go with turkey. Now you see." The papa stopped. "Go on," said the little girl. "There isn't any more." The little girl turned round, got up on her knees, took him by the shoulders, and shook him fearfully. "Now then," she said, while the papa let his head wag, after the shaking, like a Chinese mandarin's, and it was a good thing he did not let his tongue stick out. "Now, will you go on? What did the people eat in place of the turkey?" "I don't know." "You don't know, you awful papa! Well, then, what did the little girl eat?" "She?" The papa freed himself and made his preparation to escape. "Why, she ate goose. Goose is tenderer than turkey anyway, and more digestible. And there isn't so much of it, and you can't overeat yourself and have bad—" "Dreams!" cried the little girl. "Trances," said the papa, and she began to chase him all around the room. End of Story 2. Story 1. Christmas Every Day. The little girl came into her papa's study, as she always did Saturday morning before breakfast, and asked for a story. He tried to beg off that morning, for he was very busy, but she would not let him. So he began. Well, once there was a little pig. She put her hand over his mouth and stopped him at the word. She said she had heard little pig stories till she was perfectly sick of them. Well, what kind of story shall I tell, then? About Christmas. It's getting to be the season. It's past Thanksgiving already. It seems to me, her papa argued, that I've told as often about Christmas as I have about little pigs. No difference. Christmas is more interesting. Well, her papa roused himself from his writing by a great effort. Well, then, I'll tell you about the little girl that wanted it Christmas every day in the year. How would you like that? First rate, said the little girl, and she nestled into comfortable shape in his lap, ready for listening. Very well, then. This little pig, oh, what were you pounding me for? Because you said little pig instead of little girl. Well, I should like to know what's the difference between a little pig and a little girl that wanted it Christmas every day. Papa, said the little girl warningly, if you don't go on, I'll give it to you. And at this her papa darted off like lightning and began to tell the story as fast as he could. Well, once there was a little girl who liked Christmas so much that she wanted it to be Christmas every day in the year. And as soon as Thanksgiving was over, she began to send postal cards to the old Christmas fairy to ask if she mightn't have it. But the old fairy never answered any of the postals, and after a while the little girl found out that the fairy was pretty particular and wouldn't notice anything but letters, not even correspondence cards in envelopes, but real letters on sheets of paper and sealed outside with a monogram, or your initial anyway. So then she began to send her letters, and in about 3 weeks, or just the day before Christmas it was, she got a letter from the fairy saying she might have it Christmas every day for a year, and then they would see about having it longer. The little girl was a good deal excited already, preparing for the old-fashioned once-a-year Christmas that was coming the next day, and perhaps the fairy's promise didn't make such an impression on her as it would have made at some other time. She just resolved to keep it to herself and surprise everybody with it as it kept coming true, and then it slipped out of her mind altogether. She had a splendid Christmas. She went to bed early so as to let Santa Claus have a chance at the stockings, and in the morning she was up the first of anybody, and went and felt them, and found hers all lumpy with packages of candy and oranges and grapes and pocketbooks and rubber balls and all kinds of small presents, and her big brothers with nothing but the tongs in them, and her young lady sisters with a new silk umbrella, and her papas and mammas with potatoes and pieces of coal wrapped up in tissue paper, just as they always had every Christmas. Then she waited around till the rest of the family were up, and she was the first to burst into the library when the doors were opened, and look at the large presents laid out on the library table. Books and portfolios and boxes of stationery and breastpins and dolls and little stoves and dozens of handkerchiefs and inkstands and skates and snow shovels and photograph frames and little easels and boxes of watercolors and Turkish paste and nougat and candied cherries and dolls' houses and waterproofs and the big Christmas tree lighted and standing in a waste-basket in the middle. She had a splendid Christmas all day. She ate so much candy that she did not want any breakfast, and the whole forenoon the presents kept pouring in that the expressman had not had time to deliver the night before. And she went round giving the presents she had got for other people, and came home and ate turkey and cranberry for dinner, and plum pudding, and nuts and raisins and oranges, and more candy, and then went out and coasted, and came in with a stomach ache, crying. And her papa said he would see if his house was turned into that sort of fool's paradise another year. And they had a light supper, and pretty early everybody went to bed cross. Here the little girl pounded her papa in the back again. "Well, what now? Did I say pigs?" "You made them act like pigs." "Well, didn't they?" "No matter. You oughtn't to put it into a story." "Oh, very well, then. I'll take it all out." Her father went on. The little girl slept very heavily, and she slept very late, but she was awakened at last by the other children dancing round her bed with their stockings full of presents in their hands. "What is it?" said the little girl, and she rubbed her eyes and tried to rise up in bed. "Christmas, Christmas, Christmas!" they all shouted, and waved their stockings. "Nonsense! It was Christmas yesterday." Her brothers and sisters just laughed. "We don't know about that. It's Christmas today, anyway. You come into the library and see." Then all at once it flashed on the little girl that the fairy was keeping her promise, and her year of Christmases was beginning. She was dreadfully sleepy, but she sprang up like a lark that had overeaten itself and gone to bed cross, and darted into the library. There it was again, books and portfolios and boxes of stationery and breastpins. "You needn't go over it all, papa. I guess I can remember just what was there," said the little girl. Well, and there was the Christmas tree blazing away, and the family picking out their presents, but looking pretty sleepy, and her father perfectly puzzled, and her mother ready to cry. "I'm sure I don't see how I'm to dispose of all these things," said her mother, and her father said it seemed to him they had had something just like it the day before, but he supposed he must have dreamed it. This struck the little girl as the best kind of a joke, and so she ate so much candy she didn't want any breakfast, and went round carrying presents, and had turkey and cranberry for dinner, and then went out and coasted, and came in with a "Papa!" "Well, what now?" "What did you promise, you forgetful thing?" Yes." Well, the next day it was just the same thing over again, but everybody getting crosser, and at the end of a week's time so many people had lost their tempers that you could pick up lost tempers anywhere. They perfectly strewed the ground. Even when people tried to recover their tempers, they usually got somebody else's, and it made the most dreadful mix. The little girl began to get frightened, keeping the secret all to herself. She wanted to tell her mother, but she didn't dare to, and she was ashamed to ask the fairy to take back her gift. It seemed ungrateful and ill-bred, and she thought she would try to stand it, but she hardly knew how she could, for a whole year. So it went on, and it was Christmas on St. Valentine's Day and Washington's birthday, just the same as any day, and it didn't skip even the 1st of April, though everything was counterfeit that day, and that was some little relief. After a while, coal and potatoes began to be awfully scarce, so many had been wrapped up in tissue paper to fool papas and mammas with. Turkeys got to be about $1,000 apiece. "Papa!" "Well, what?" "You're beginning to fib." "Well, 2,000 then." And they got to passing off almost anything for turkeys. half-grown hummingbirds, and even rocks out of the Arabian Nights. The real turkeys were so scarce. And cranberries, well, they asked a diamond apiece for cranberries. All the woods and orchards were cut down for Christmas trees, and where the woods and orchards used to be, it looked just like a stubble field with the stumps. After a while, they had to make Christmas trees out of rags and stuff them with bran like old-fashioned dolls. But there were plenty of rags, because people got so poor buying presents for one another that they couldn't get any new clothes, and they just wore their old ones to tatters. They got so poor that everybody had to go to the poorhouse, except the confectioners and the fancy storekeepers and the picture book sellers and the expressmen. And they all got so rich and proud that they would hardly wait upon a person when he came to buy. It was perfectly shameful. Well, after it had gone on about 3 or 4 months, the little girl, whenever she came into the room in the morning and saw those great, ugly, lumpy stockings dangling at the fireplace, and the disgusting presents around everywhere, used to just sit down and burst out crying. In 6 months she was perfectly exhausted. She couldn't even cry any more. She just lay on the lounge and rolled her eyes and panted. About the beginning of October she took to sitting down on dolls wherever she found them, French dolls or any kind. She hated the sight of them so, and by Thanksgiving she was crazy and just slammed her presents across the room. By that time people didn't carry presents around nicely any more. They flung them over the fence, or through the window, or anything. And instead of running their tongues out and taking great pains to write, "For dear Papa," or Mama, or Brother, or Sister, or Susie, or Sammy, or Billy, or Bobby, or Jimmy, or Jenny, or whoever it was, and troubling to get the spelling right, and then signing their names, and Xmas 18 what, they used to write in the gift books, "Take it, you horrid old thing," and then go and bang it against the front door. Nearly everybody had built barns to hold their presents, but pretty soon the barns overflowed, and then they used to let them lie out in the rain or anywhere. Sometimes the police used to come and tell them to shovel their presents off the sidewalk, or they would arrest them. "I thought you said everybody had gone to the poorhouse," interrupted the little girl. "They did go at first," said her papa, "but after a while the poorhouses got so full that they had to send the people back to their own houses. They tried to cry when they got back, but they couldn't make the least sound." "Why couldn't they?" "Because they had lost their voices saying 'Merry Christmas' so much. Did I tell you how it was on the 4th of July?" "No, how was it?" And the little girl nestled closer in expectation of something uncommon. "Well, the night before, the boys stayed up to celebrate, as they always do, and fell asleep before 12 o'clock, as usual, expecting to be wakened by the bells and cannon. But it was nearly 8 o'clock before the first boy in the United States woke up, and then he found out what the trouble was. As soon as he could get his clothes on, he ran out of the house and smashed a big cannon torpedo down on the pavement. But it didn't make any more noise than a damp wad of paper. And after he tried about 20 or 30 more, he began to pick them up and look at them. Every single torpedo was a big raisin. Then he just streaked it upstairs and examined his firecrackers and toy pistol and $2 collection of fireworks, and found that they were nothing but sugar and candy painted up to look like fireworks. Before 10 o'clock, every boy in the United States found out that his 4th of July things had turned into Christmas things, And then they just sat down and cried. They were so mad. There are about 20 million boys in the United States, and so you can imagine what a noise they made. Some men got together before night, with a little powder that hadn't turned into purple sugar yet, and they said they would fire off one cannon anyway. But the cannon burst into 1,000 pieces, for it was nothing but rock candy, and some of the men nearly got killed. The 4th of July orations all turned into Christmas carols, and when anybody tried to read the Declaration, instead of saying, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary," he was sure to sing, "God rest ye merry gentlemen." It was perfectly awful. The little girl drew a deep sigh of satisfaction. And how was it at Thanksgiving? Her papa hesitated. "Well, I'm almost afraid to tell you. I'm afraid you'll think it's wicked." "Well, tell anyway," said the little girl. Well, before it came Thanksgiving, it had leaked out who had caused all these Christmases. The little girl had suffered so much that she had talked about it in her sleep, and after that hardly anybody would play with her. People just perfectly despised her, because if it had not been for her greediness it wouldn't have happened. And now, when it came Thanksgiving, and she wanted them to go to church and have squash pie and turkey and show their gratitude, they said that all the turkeys had been eaten up for her old Christmas dinners, and if she would stop the Christmases, they would see about the gratitude. Wasn't it dreadful? And the very next day the little girl began to send letters to the Christmas fairy, and then telegrams to stop it. But it didn't do any good, and then she got to calling at the fairy's house, but the girl that came to the door always said, "Not at home," or "Engaged," or "At dinner," or something like that. And so it went on till it came to the old once-a-year Christmas Eve. The little girl fell asleep, and when she woke up in the morning, she found it was all nothing but a dream, suggested the little girl. No, indeed, said her papa. It was all every bit true. Well, what did she find out then? Why, that it wasn't Christmas at last, and wasn't ever going to be any more. Now it's time for breakfast. The little girl held her papa fast around the neck. You shan't go if you're going to leave it so. Well, how do you want it left? Christmas once a year. All right, said her papa, and he went on again. Well, there was the greatest rejoicing all over the country, and it extended clear up into Canada. The people met together everywhere and kissed and cried for joy. The city carts went around and gathered up all the candy and raisins and nuts and dumped them into the river, and it made the fish perfectly sick. And the whole United States, as far out as Alaska, was one blaze of bonfires, where the children were burning up their gift books and presents of all kinds. They had the greatest time. The little girl went to thank the old fairy because she had stopped its being Christmas, and she said she hoped she would keep her promise and see that Christmas never, never came again. Then the fairy frowned and asked her if she was sure she knew what she meant, and the little girl asked her why not. And the old fairy said that now she was behaving just as greedily as ever, and she'd better look out. This made the little girl think it all over carefully again, and she said she would be willing to have it Christmas about once in 1,000 years. And then she said 100, and then she said 10, and at last she got down to 1. Then the fairy said that was the good old way that had pleased people ever since Christmas began, and she was agreed. Then the little girl said, "What are your shoes made of?" And the fairy said, "Leather." And the little girl said, "Bargain's done forever," and skipped off and hippity-hopped the whole way home, she was so glad. "Now how will that do?" asked the papa. "First rate," said the little girl, but she hated to have the story stop, and was rather sober. However, her mamma put her head in at the door and asked her papa, "Are you never coming to breakfast? What have you been telling that child?" "Oh, just a moral tale." The little girl caught him round the neck again. "We know. Don't you tell what, papa? Don't you tell what?" End of story 1.
This holiday, celebrate with your favorite classic literature. Our Gumroad shop has over a dozen annotated classics, including The Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland, Sherlock Holmes, and more. Each of our premium audiobooks come with commentary and annotations, and sometimes even video. Visit craftlit.gumroad.com. That's CraftLit.gumroad, GUM as in Mary, ROAD as in dog.com, and buy them as a gift or buy them for yourself. Thank you for supporting us, and have a great one. Bye. The Potato Child by Mrs. Charles J. Woodbury. It was certain that Elsie had a very hard and solitary life. When Miss Amanda had selected her from among the girls at the home, the motherly matron felt sorry. She is a tender-hearted little thing, and a kind word goes a long way with Elsie. Miss Amanda took a look at the matron as if she was speaking Greek and said nothing. It was quite plain that few words, either kind or unkind, would pass Miss Amanda's lips. But the home was more than full, and Miss Amanda Armstrong was a person well known as the leading dressmaker in the city, a person of some money, not obliged to work now if she didn't wish to. If cold, she is at least perfectly just, they all said. So Elsie went to work for Miss Amanda and lived in the kitchen. She waited on the door, washed the dishes, cleaned the vegetables, and set the table. Miss Amanda lived alone and ate in the kitchen. Every Friday she swept the house, and her bed was in a little room in the back attic. When she came, Miss Amanda handed her a dress and a petticoat and a pair of shoes. "These are to last 6 months," she said, "and see you keep yourself clean." She also gave her one change of stockings and underclothes. "Here is your room. You do not need a light to go by, and it is not healthy to sleep under too many covers." It wasn't so much what Miss Amanda did to her, for she never struck her, not in any way ill-treated her, nor was it so much what she said, for she said almost nothing. But she said it in all commands, and the loving little Elsie was just driven into herself. She had had a darling mother, full of love and tenderness, and Elsie would say to herself, "I must not forget the things Mamma told me. Love can never die, and kind words can never die." But she had no one to love, and she never heard any kind words, so she was a bit worried. "I shall forget how kind words sound, and I shall forget how to love," sighed the little girl. She used to long for a doll or a cat or something she could call her own and talk to. She asked Miss Amanda, who said, "No." She added, "I have no money to give for such foolishness as a doll, and a cat would eat its head off." Miss Amanda had been blessed with no little girl time. When she was young, she had always been forced to work hard, and she thought it was no worse for Elsie than it had been for herself. I don't suppose it was, but one looking in on these two could not help but feel for both of them. Elsie would try to talk to herself a little at night, but it was cheerless. Then she would lift up her knee and draw the sheet about it for a hood and call it a little girl. She named it Nancy Pullum, and would try to love that, but it almost broke her back when she tried to hug Nancy. "Oh, if I had something to be good to," she said. So she began greeting the ladies when she opened the door with a cheerful "Good morning" or "Good afternoon." "I wouldn't do that," said Miss Amanda. "It looks forward and pert. It is their place to say good morning, not yours. You have no occasion to speak to your betters, and anyway, children should be seen and not heard." One day, a never-forgotten day, she went down to the cellar to the bin of potatoes to select some for dinner. She was sorting them over and laying out all of one size when she took up quite a long one, and lo, it had a little face on it, and two eyes and a little hump between for a nose and a long crack below that made a very pretty mouth. Elsie looked at it joyfully. "I will make me a child," she said. "No matter if it has no arms or legs, the face is everything." She carefully placed it at the end of the bin, and whenever she could slip away without neglecting her work, she would run down to the cellar and talk softly to it. But one day, her potato child was gone. Elsie's heart gave a big jump and then fell like lead and then seemed to lie perfectly still. But it commenced to beat again, beat and ache, beat and ache. She tried to look for the changeling, but the tears made her so that she couldn't see very well, and there were so many potatoes. She looked every moment she had a chance all the next day and cried a great deal. "I can never be real happy again," she thought. "Don't cry any more," said Miss Amanda. "It does not look well when you open the door for my customers. You have enough to eat and wear. What more do you want?" "Something to love," said Elsie, but not very loud. She tried not to cry again, and then she felt worse not to shed tears when perhaps her dear little potato child was eaten up. 2 days after, as she was still searching, a little piece of white paper in the far dark corner attracted her attention. She went over and lifted it up. Behind it was a hole, and partly in and partly out of that hole lay her potato child. I think a rat had dragged it out of the bin. She hugged it to her heart and cried for joy. "Oh, my darling, you have come back to me. You have come back." And then it seemed as if the pink eyes of the potato child looked up into Elsie's in affectionate gratitude, and it became plain to Elsie that her child loved her. She was so thankful that she even kissed the little piece of white paper. "If it hadn't been for you, I would never have found my child. I mean to keep you always," she said, and she wrapped it about her potato child and put them in her bosom. "We must never be parted again," she murmured. At supper, with many misgivings, she unwrapped her treasure for Miss Amanda and asked if she could keep it as her own. "I won't eat any potato for dinner tomorrow if you will give me this," she said. "Well," answered Miss Amanda, "I don't know as it will do any harm. Why do you want it?" "It is my potato child. I want to love it." "See you lose no time then," said Miss Amanda. And afterward, Elsie never called the potato it, but always my child. She found a fragment of calico large enough for a dress and skirt, with enough over. A queer three-cornered piece, which she pinned about the unequal shoulders for a shawl, and upon the bonnet she worked for days. All of this sewing was a great joy to her, and last of all she begged for a bit of frayed muslin from the sweepings for a night dress, and then she could undress her baby every night. She must have heard a tiny tuber voice, for she said, "Now I can never forget the sound of loving words, and the world is full of joy." Elsie had a candle box in her room, with the cover hung on hinges. It served the double purpose of a trunk and a seat. She put her child's clothes and the scrap of white paper in this box. In the daytime, she let her child sit upon the window sill so she could see the big blue sky. But when the weather grew colder, she took her down to the kitchen each morning, lest she should suffer. Sometimes Miss Amanda watched her closely. She does her work, but she is a queer thing. She makes me uneasy, she thought. Christmas was coming. Elsie and her mother had always loved Christmas, and had invariably given some gift to each other. After their stockings were hung side by side Christmas Eve, her mother would take her in her lap and tell her the Christmas story. So now it was a great mercy for Elsie that she had her child to work for. One day, when she had scrubbed the pantry floor unusually clean, Miss Amanda gave her the privilege of the rag barrel. This resulted in a new Christmas suit of silk and velvet for baby, and this she made. When Elsie left the home, the matron had given her a little needlebook containing a spool of thread and a thimble for a goodbye present. These now came into play. She used the lamp shears to cut with. When all was done, the babe looked beautiful, except that it had no stockings. But it had not even legs. "I'll make her a wooden leg and let her be a cripple. Then I shall love her all the better." But after she made the leg, and a very good one, too, she hadn't had the heart to break the skin of her child and push it in. "I'll make the stockings without legs," she said. And so she did. Elsie was very careful never to let her child see or mention before her how busy she was for Christmas. She felt very sorry for Miss Amanda and wished she had something to give her, but she could think of nothing except the piece of white paper she found with her potato child. The afternoon before Christmas, she took it from the candle box and smoothed it out upon the cover. It had some writing upon one side. Elsie thought it was very pretty writing. It had so many flourishes. Elsie could not read it, of course, but she hoped Miss Amanda would like it. But how should she give it to her? She didn't dare hand it to her outright, and she was certain Miss Amanda wouldn't hang any stockings, so just before dark, she slipped into Miss Amanda's sleeping room and laid it on the brown cushion just in front of the mirror. When Elsie had finished her work, she went to her room, pinned her child's stocking to the foot of the bed, and slyly tucked in the new suit she had made. Her own stockings lay flat upon the floor. Her breath caught a little as she noticed them. "But it doesn't matter," she said. "Parents never care for themselves if they can give their children pleasure." She crept into bed and took her child on her arm. The night was very cold. The frost made mysterious noises on the roof, in the nail holes, and on the glass. She went to bed early because the kitchen was so cold. She thought, "We can talk in bed." The lock of her door was broken, and she could not shut it tight. Through this, the air came chilly. Miss Amanda put on her flannel wrapper and her bed slippers and sat down before the open fire in her sleeping room. Some way she couldn't keep her thoughts from that little back attic room. She went into the hall, silently up the stairs, and stood outside the door. Elsie was talking softly, but Miss Amanda could hear every word thanks to the broken lock. "I have much to tell you tonight, dear child," she heard the waif say. "The whole story of the Christmas child. It was years ago. His mother was very young, I guess about twice as old as I am. They hadn't any house. They were in a barn. I think there were no houses to rent in that town, but she fixed a little cradle for him in the feed box and wrapped him in long clothes, as I do you, my darling. The angels sang a new song for him. A new star shone in the east for him. Some men with sheep came to visit him, and some rich men brought him lovely presents. My mother told me all these things, and I mustn't forget them. It helps me to remember to tell it to you. So now this lovely Christmas child, born in a little bit of a town, oh, my child, with a mournful cry, I've forgotten the name of the town. I used to say it to my mother. It's the town of, I can't remember. Miss Amanda could hear her crying a little softly. Never mind, she said presently. I'm very sorry. I haven't told that story often enough. I wish I had someone to teach me a little, but maybe it don't make so much difference if I've forgotten the name of the town. He came to teach us. Sure, I won't forget that. Love can never die. That's the present he gave to everybody. So if nobody else gives us a Christmas present, we always have the one he gave us. Silence for a little while. I am very sorry for Miss Amanda, dear. She has no child to love. She has a very sad and lonely life. Her teeth chattered a little. It seems like a very cold night. The covers are quite thin, but we can never really suffer while our hearts are so warm. I'm glad you feel real well and are just as plump as ever, but your skin is just a little bit wrinkled. You are not going to take cold or be sick. Oh, I couldn't give you up. I should miss you so much, you happy, good little child. Miss Amanda heard a kiss. Good night, dear. I am so tired. God bless us all and help us to remember Miss Amanda and let her find her present tonight. Miss Amanda crept back to her warm room and waited until she was sure the child was fast asleep. Then she took down a quilt off the foot of her own bed, picked up her candle, and retraced her way upstairs. She softly dropped the comforter upon Elsie. She heard as a sort of echo a soft sigh of content. Miss Amanda waited a moment, and then, shading the candle with one hand, she looked at the sleeping child. The face was pale and thin. The lashes lay dark upon the white cheeks. They were quite wet, but pressed close to them and carefully covered by little toil-hardened hands was the grotesque potato in its white nightgown. Miss Amanda was surprised by a queer click in her throat and hurried out of the room. She stood before her fire, candle in hand, and bitterly compressed her lips. She hopes I'll find my Christmas present tonight? Who will send it to me, and what will it be? Whom do I care for, and whom cares for me? No one, not one human being. She crossed the room and, placing her candle upon the dressing table, gazed at herself in the glass. I am growing old and hard and perfectly friendless. But why that start and cry? Well, there before her eyes, in the big, flourishing, boyish handwriting so well remembered, she reads, Our love can never die. We have nothing in the world except each other, dear sister, and no matter what may come, our love can never change. She snatched up the paper and threw herself into a chair. Where did it come from? She cried. What evil genius placed it here this night? Haven't I years ago torn and destroyed every word that wretched boy ever wrote to me? She tossed her arms over her head and rocked back and forth and groaned aloud. She could not help her thoughts now or keep them from going back over the past. Her heart softened as she remembered, and the scalding tears fell. She was only a child, not much older than the one upstairs, when her dying mother had placed her baby brother in her arms, saying, Here is all I have to leave you, Amanda. I know you love him. Don't ever be harsh or unforgiving to him. How had she kept her trust? She had loved him. She had worked early and worked late for him. She had given up everything. But she had been ill repaid. The fire burned low, and the room settled cold and still. She seemed to feel a pair of boyish arms about her neck and a boy's rough kiss upon her cheek. When she was but a young woman, she had moved to the big city and started her dressmaker's shop so that he could have a better chance at school. What a loving boy he was, so full of fun. The wind whistled outside. She thought it was he, and she heard him again. "You're my handsome sister. Not one of the fellows has as handsome a sister as I." How proud she had felt when she had started him off to college. "It only means a few years of harder work, and then I'll be able to see my boy take his stand with anyone." But now she wept and groaned afresh. Oh, how could he treat me so? How could he, that wretched disgrace? He had been expelled. The president's letter was severe, but the young man's letter regretted it only as a boyish prank. He was sorry. He never expected anything so serious would come of it. He deserved the disgrace. It only hurt him through his love for her. But only forgive him, and he would show her what he could yet do. What had he done? He had tied a calf to the president's doorbell. She remembered her answer to this letter asking for her forgiveness. It stood before her written in characters of flame. Had she in this been harsh to the boy, the only legacy her dying mother had to leave her? "Never speak to me nor see my face again. You have disgraced yourself and me." It was not so long a letter, but she could easily remember it. Afterward, the president himself had written again to her. He thought perhaps he'd been a bit too hasty. It was truly, after all, only a boy's prank. It was, of course, ungentlemanly, but the trick was played on All Fool's Night, and that should have had greater weight than it did. The faculty were willing, after proper apologies were made, to excuse it and take her brother back. Where was her brother? He could not be found, and not one word had she heard of him since she sent that dreadful letter. He might be dead. Oh, how often she thought that. Now she wrung her hands and covered her wet cheeks with them. Her hair fell about her shoulders as she shook in her agony of remorse. What noise is this? The doorbell pealing through the silent house. Again and again it rings. She did not hear this bell. She was listening to another, and how it rang. Louder and louder how it rang, and well it might, with a calf jumping around, trying to get away from it. Even in all her misery, so near together are the ecstasies of emotion. She laughed aloud, and then shuddered at the thought that she should never again hear any noise quite so loud as this of the past. Then she felt, in the silent, chill room, a tattered presence, a little half-frozen hand upon her own. She turned her streaming eyes, and they were met by the big, wide eyes of Elsie. "Miss Amanda, didn't you hear the doorbell ringing? There is something, no, there is somebody waiting downstairs for you." Half dazed, half afraid, ashamed of her tears, Miss Amanda left the room, led by the child as by an unearthly presence into an unearthly presence. Who was this bearded man that folded her into his strong, true arms? "I have so much to tell you, dear child. I am such a happy little girl. Miss Amanda's dear brother has come home. She is so happy, and she loves him so much, and oh, darling, they both love me. And it was all you. You did it. Oh, there is no knowing how much good one sweet, loving, contented potato child can do in a house." The End of The Potato Child and Others by Mrs. Charles J. Woodley, 1905.
$1.87. That was all, and 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. 3 times Della counted it. $1.87, and the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl, so Della did it, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the home is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home, a furnished flat at $8 per week. It did not exactly beggar description, but it certainly had that word on the lookout for the mendicancy squad. In the vestibule below was a letter box, into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. Also appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name, Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity when its possessor was being paid $30 per week. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, though, they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim, and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. Della finished her cry and attended to her cheeks with a powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a gray cat walking a gray fence in a gray backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She had been saving every penny she could for months, with this result. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim, her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him, something fine and rare and sterling, something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. There was a pier glass between the windows of the room. Perhaps you have seen a pier glass in an $8 flat. A very thin and very agile person may, by observing his reflection in a rapid sequence of longitudinal strips, obtain a fairly accurate conception of his looks. Della, being slender, had mastered the art. Suddenly she whirled from the window and stood before the glass. Her eyes were shining brilliantly, but her face had lost its color within 20 seconds. Rapidly she pulled down her hair and let it fall to its full length. Now there were two possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hair hang out the window some day to dry, just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor, with all his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck at his beard from envy. So now Della's beautiful hair fell about her, rippling and shining like a cascade of brown waters. It reached below her knee and made itself almost a garment for her. And then she did it up again nervously and quickly. Once she faltered for a minute and stood still, while a tear or two splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown jacket, on went her old brown hat, and with a whirl of skirts and with the brilliant sparkle still in her eyes, she fluttered out the door and down the stairs to the street. Where she stopped, the sign read, Madame Sofronie, hair goods of all kinds. One flight up Della ran and collected herself, panting. Madame, large, too white, chilly, hardly looked the Sofronie. "Will you buy my hair?"
asked Della. I buy hair, said Madame. Take your hat off and let's have a sight at the looks of it. Down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said Madame, lifting the mass with a practiced hand. Give it to me quick, said Della. Oh, and the next 2 hours tripped by on rosy wings. Forget the hashed metaphor. She was ransacking the stores for Jim's present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned all of them inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone, and not by meretricious ornamentation, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was like him, quietness and value. The description applied to both. $21 they took from her for it, and she hurried home with the 87 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly on account of the old leather strap that he used in place of a chain. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. She got out her curling irons and lighted the gas and went to work repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love, which is always a tremendous task, dear friends, a mammoth task. Within 40 minutes, her head was covered with tiny, close-lying curls that made her look wonderfully like a truant schoolboy. She looked at her reflection in the mirror long, carefully, and critically. If Jim doesn't kill me, she said to herself, before he takes a second look at me, he'll say I look like a Coney Island chorus girl. But what could I do? Oh, what could I do with $1.87? At 7 o'clock, the coffee was made and the frying pan was on the back of the stove, hot and ready to cook the chops. Jim was never late. Della doubled the fob chain in her hand and sat on the corner of the table near the door that he always entered. Then she heard his step on the stair, away down on the first flight, and she turned white for just a moment. She had a habit of saying a little silent prayer about the simplest everyday things, and now she whispered, "Please, God, make him think I am still pretty." The door opened and Jim stepped in and closed it. He looked thin and very serious. Poor fellow, he was only 22 and to be burdened with a family. He needed a new overcoat and he was without gloves. Jim stopped inside the door, as immovable as a setter at the scent of quail. His eyes were fixed upon Della, and there was an expression in them that she could not read, and it terrified her. It was not anger, nor surprise, nor disapproval, nor horror, nor any of the sentiments that she had been prepared for. He simply stared at her fixedly with that peculiar expression on his face. Della wriggled off the table and went for him. "Jim, darling," she cried, "don't look at me that way. I had my hair cut off and sold because I couldn't have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It'll grow out again. You won't mind, will you? I just had to do it. My hair grows awfully fast. Say Merry Christmas, Jim, and let's be happy. You don't know what a beautiful, nice gift I've got for you. You've cut off your hair?" asked Jim, laboriously, as if he had not arrived at that patent fact yet, even after the hardest mental labor. "Cut it off and sold it," said Della. Don't you like me just as well anyhow? I'm me without my hair, ain't I? Jim looked about the room curiously. You say your hair is gone, he said with an air almost of idiocy. You needn't look for it, said Della. It's sold, I tell you, sold and gone, too. It's Christmas Eve, boy. Be good to me, for it went for you. Maybe the hairs of my head were numbered, she went on with sudden, serious sweetness, but nobody could ever count my love for you. Shall I put the chops on, Jim? Out of his trance, Jim seemed quickly to wake. He enfolded his Della. For 10 seconds, let us regard with discreet scrutiny some inconsequential object in the other direction. $8 a week or $1 million a year. What is the difference? A mathematician or wit would give you the wrong answer. The Magi brought valuable gifts, but that was not among them. This dark assertion will be illuminated later on. Jim drew a package from his overcoat pocket and threw it upon the table. Don't make any mistake, Dell, he said, about me. I don't think there's anything in the way of a haircut or a shave or a shampoo that could make me like my girl any less. But if you'll unwrap that package, you may see why you had me going a while at first. White fingers and nimble tore at the string and paper, and then an ecstatic scream of joy, and then, alas, a quick feminine change to hysterical tears and wails, necessitating the immediate employment of all the comforting powers of the lord of the flat. For there lay the combs. The set of combs, side and back, that Della had worshipped long in a Broadway window. Beautiful combs, pure tortoise shell, with jeweled rims, just the shade to wear in the beautiful, vanished hair. They were expensive combs, she knew, and her heart had simply craved and yearned over them without the least hope of possession. And now they were hers, but the tresses that should have adorned the coveted adornments were gone. But she hugged them to her bosom, and at length she was able to look up with dim eyes and a smile and say, "My hair grows so fast, Jim." And then Della leaped up like a singed cat and cried, "Oh, oh!" Jim had not yet seen his beautiful present. She held it out to him eagerly upon her open palm. The dull, precious metal seemed to flash with a reflection of her bright and ardent spirit. "Isn't it a dandy, Jim? I hunted all over town to find it. You'll have to look at the time 100 times a day now. Give me your watch. I want to see how it looks on it." Instead of obeying, Jim tumbled down on the couch and put his hands under the back of his head and smiled. "Dell," said he, "let's put our Christmas presents away and keep 'em a while. They're too nice to use just at present. I sold the watch to get the money to buy your combs. And now suppose you put the chops on." The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men, who brought gifts to the babe in the manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. Being wise, their gifts were no doubt wise ones, possibly bearing the privilege of exchange in case of duplication. And here I have lamely related to you the uneventful chronicle of 2 foolish children in a flat who most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. But in a last word to the wise of these days, let it be said that of all who give gifts, these 2 were the wisest. Of all who give and receive gifts, such as they are wisest. Everywhere they are wisest. They are the Magi. End of The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy what we do at CraftLit and want to listen to more of our audio, feel free to visit us at our Gumroad shop and check out all our premium annotated books. Charles Dickens's Bleak House, for example, has more than 40 hours worth of annotated audiobook. We are not joking. If this is something you're interested in, go to craftlit.gumroad.com. That's CraftLit.gumroad, Gum as in Mary, ROAD as in dog.com to access our premium books or buy them as a gift. Happy holidays. If you enjoy what we do here on CraftLit, please don't forget to like and subscribe on iTunes. Give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button on YouTube. You can also support the show by subscribing to the CraftLit App Premium feed. You can check the link below for details. Your support helps keep CraftLit going strong, and we've got plenty of ways for you to get involved now. If you want more perks, you can head over to Patreon at patreon.com/craftlit and become a patron of this art. You can also join our YouTube channel memberships for access to tons of premium books as bonuses, or you can support us at ko-fi.com/craftlit. And guess what? We've just relaunched our premium memberships over on craftlit.com. Go to craftlit.com/premium and check out all of the details there. Link is below as well. For a one-stop shop to all things CraftLit, please visit Linktree at linktr.ee/CraftLit channel. This is your go-to hub for all of our social media and more. They're all listed there for you. And I keep forgetting to mention, come join our Facebook group. It is full of the kindest, most creative makers and readers, and even some people who never really used to read. We've got them now. All right, that's it for now. Thank you. Take care of yourself. Have a great one. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye.